One, speak to us today and give us ears to hear. Amen. Please be seated. In today's readings, we have a tale of two disciples. On the one hand, we have the passage from Acts, a story which tells us how a man named Saul, who had been ruthlessly persecuting Christians, was suddenly struck blind on the road to Damascus. There, Saul heard a voice, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" And he said, "Who are you, Lord?" And the voice said, "Jesus, the one whom you are persecuting." Later, Saul was healed by Ananias, regained his sight, and was baptized and took a new name, Paul. The Apostle Paul later becomes the most impactful missionary in history. And on the other hand, we have a story from John which tells us about how a man named Simon, who just after the greatest failure of his life, found healing, forgiveness, and a welcome back into relationship. Jesus called Simon Cephas, the Aramaic equivalent to the Greek word Petros, which means rock. The Apostle Peter became the cornerstone on which the church was built. Peter and Paul were very different. Peter was one of the original 12 and one of Jesus' inner circle, walked closely with him during Jesus' life on earth. Paul was a Pharisee who was hunting the early Christians and who stood by and held the cloaks as Stephen became the first martyr. Peter was a working man, a fisherman. Paul was an educated man, a scholar. These two disagreed frequently during their lifetime, Peter and Paul. But they both died a martyr's death in Rome, and now, centuries later, they share the same feast day, June 29th. A tale of two disciples. And in today's readings, Jesus forgives them both. In today's readings, we hear about arguably what is both of their worst moments. They have both committed terrible wrongs. Paul was, again, persecuting Christians, stood by as a man was murdered, maybe more than once. Peter, who was arguably closer to Jesus than anyone else in the disciples, denied knowing Jesus 3 times, just hours before Jesus died. And some of the accounts say that Jesus was close enough to hear it happen, even after predicting it would, knowing it would, to hear it with his own ears. One of the Gospels says that he locked eyes with Peter just as the rooster crowed. A tale of the two greatest disciples and their two greatest failures. And we could skip to the end and say that's the good news. None of us are defined by our worst moments or the things that haunt us, our worst mistakes. None of us, just like Peter and Paul, are defined by those moments, and it's worth remembering. So that's pretty good news. But this moment in the passage from John, sometimes called the reinstatement of Peter, has captivated Christian imagination for centuries because it is dramatic and tender. And the Greek wording is intriguing. In this scene, it is early morning, just after sunrise. The disciples have been out fishing all night long and caught nothing. They're probably not in the best of moods. In fact, the only reason they're out fishing at all is because Peter randomly got a hair and said, I'm going to go out and go fishing. And all the rest of them said, okay, we'll go with you. Which makes complete sense to me. Because Peter, again, has had the worst days of his life. And none of them want him to be alone. And none of them want to be alone. So Peter says, okay, I'm going to go fishing, maybe to get his mind off of everything else. And they say, okay, then we're all going fishing. And what happens at sunrise? The rooster crows, right? Well, they crow a lot before that too, but symbolically, they crow at sunrise. And these disciples, after fishing all night long with no success, happen to look over to the shore and see a man standing there. And the man calls out, "Children, you have no fish, have you?" Well, no. And he says, okay, cast the net on the right side of the boat. And I have to wonder if they probably tried that at some point during the night. And maybe they thought this is a fruitless exercise, but okay, we'll humor this man on the shore. And when they did, it came back full of 153 fish. And on a side note, scholars have wrote pages and pages trying to figure out the significance of the number 153. And they cannot agree on an answer. The beloved disciple, after they catch this miraculous catch, says to Peter, "It's the Lord." And the writer tells us that Peter immediately put his clothes back on and jumped into the sea, which is a very weird thing to happen. Two very weird things to happen. Scholars have wondered about this detail, about Peter being naked. If you're out fishing, that doesn't seem the wisest move. And so scholars have wondered, is this symbolic rather than literal? Because John loves symbols. So this reference to Peter being naked and putting his clothes back on, once John tells him it's Jesus on the shore. Some think this is a callback to Genesis, where Adam and Eve eat that forbidden fruit and suddenly realize that they are naked, and they make clothes for themselves and cover themselves up. And they do that when they hear God coming through the garden, approaching them. And so in this same moment, someone points out to Peter, it's Jesus. And he feels shame and covers himself up, just like Adam and Eve. So maybe it's literal, maybe it's symbolic. But he put his clothes on, for he felt shame, and he jumped into the sea. And I find it so interesting that the gospel writer, who was so detail-oriented enough to tell us that there were exactly 153 fish, did not tell us what Peter did once he jumped in the water. I have always assumed, and most people have always assumed, he swam straight to the shore, because he couldn't just wait for the boat to go the 100 yards to get there. But nowhere does it say that that's what he did. We have framed the story as this leap of faith, maybe reminiscent of the time that Peter walks on water a few steps and eventually loses his faith and falls into the sea, and Jesus rescues him. So we framed that story as a moment, a callback. Here, Peter jumps into the sea again. He's off on another leap of faith. I've always thought of him as being compelled by love and eagerness to get to Jesus as fast as he can. Because what a nice way to read the story. And it is somewhat characteristic. We know Peter's impulsive. He does things without thinking. He says things without thinking. But the writer never says what he does or where he swims. It only says that Peter jumped into the sea and that the other disciples come to the shore on the boat. But the last thing that Peter had said in Jesus' presence was what? I do not know him. 3 times, I do not know him. I do not know what you're talking about. Maybe Peter jumped into the sea for a different reason. Maybe he was hiding. Maybe he wasn't that eager. Maybe he felt ashamed. We have this detail about him covering himself up, a reference maybe to Genesis. And so maybe he felt ashamed and jumped into the sea like, oh gosh, I cannot face him. Maybe the impulse driving him was shame rather than eagerness. But even if he did swim straight to shore, Jesus gives us no indication that Peter and Jesus spoke to each other. Maybe he had no idea what to say. Maybe the detail isn't included because none of the other disciples were on the shore to overhear what was said, or maybe nothing was said. There's so much we don't know. But the scene is so deliberate, and every detail appears to be crafted just for Peter. Jesus is setting a scene to give Peter a chance that many of us don't get when we've hurt someone we love. A do-over. A second chance. On that morning when they're fishing and they come to the shore, they find a charcoal fire burning. And it's the same word used to describe the fire as was used to describe the one that Peter stood next to when he gave his 3 denials, a charcoal fire. And we know the smell is attached to memory. So when Peter comes to approach this fire, I feel certain that he smelled that charcoal and remembered that just days earlier, also at a charcoal fire, he had made maybe the biggest mistake of his life. And Jesus invites all of them to a meal and feeds them just like the last time they were together. It really is a do-over of Maundy Thursday. They have their breakfast of loaves and fishes, another callback. And Jesus says, perhaps in front of everyone, perhaps alone, we're not sure, Simon, son of John, do you truly love me? Of course, Lord, you know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my lambs. Sometimes I wonder if what he meant was, prove it. Feed my lambs. Simon, son of John, do you love me? Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Then tend my sheep. And after that 3rd time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter felt hurt. And I've always assumed that Peter's hurt came from a kind of righteous indignation. Somewhat characteristic again of Peter. That he got offended. Of course, Lord, you know that I love you. But maybe Peter is hurt because he remembers how he felt at that first charcoal fire. I've always assumed Peter's tone to be exasperated. Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. But what if it wasn't? What if instead of being exasperated, Peter is a little desperate? Lord, you know I love you. What if Peter needed Jesus to believe that he loved him so that Peter could believe it himself? Peter and Paul, these two greatest disciples and their two greatest failures, we see a dichotomy between knowing and loving. Peter is closer to Jesus than maybe anyone else, but he has to prove his love. He has to restate it, learn how to show it. And Paul, who never met Jesus during his earthly life, hears a voice on that road to Damascus and says, "Who are you, Lord?" Because he doesn't know. He's never heard Jesus' voice before. On Maundy Thursday, when people ask Peter if he's a disciple, Peter says, "I do not know him." But afterwards, at this new charcoal fire, Jesus asked Peter, "Do you love me?" And Peter says, "Yes." Knowing Jesus versus loving Jesus. Peter and Paul teach us how we need to do both. Maybe we know Jesus pretty well. Maybe we have spent years in church learning about him and memorizing verses, or going to seminary. Maybe like Peter, we want to prove to Jesus and to ourselves that we love him. But how? How? Jesus gives us the answer. Feed my lambs and tend my sheep. One of Jesus' favorite metaphors for himself was the Good Shepherd. And so this moment with Peter is not just forgiveness and welcome and reinstatement, but also a handoff. I'm the Good Shepherd, but where I'm going you cannot follow. So you tend my lambs. You feed my sheep. You are my hands and feet and love in the world. Jesus' ministry on earth is done. So he has passed down the job to Peter, and then through Peter to us. To love Jesus is to love those that Jesus loved, to care for those that Jesus cared for, the oppressed, the vulnerable, the forgotten, orphans and widows, strangers and enemies. Feed my lambs, tend my sheep. And so I wonder, if Jesus was here among us, and the old saying says that when two or three are gathered, if Jesus was here among us and said, "St. Anthony's Episcopal Church in Silverdale, do you really love me?" And if we said, "Yes, Lord, you know everything. You know that we love you." And if he said then, "Feed my lambs, tend my sheep," what would our next steps be?